All right, let's get right into it. We've all been there, right? That moment when the payment screen flips around asking for 15, 20, or even 25%. Well, today we're digging into a brand new policy that tackles America's very complicated tipping culture head on. No tax on tips. So, is it the fix workers have been waiting for, or is it a flaw that just makes things worse? And look, it's not just a hunch. The data is pretty clear. Tip fatigue is a real thing. It feels like we're getting asked to tip for everything now, from coffee to retail, and that's creating this growing feeling among customers that, hey, we're the ones having to pay workers' wages. This sentiment is the exact backdrop for this major new tax policy. Now, on the surface, a tax break for tipped workers sounds like a total win-win. But as you're about to see, the reality is, well, it's a lot more complicated than that. So the big question we're tackling here is this. When all the dust settles, who actually comes out on top with this new law? Okay, so to answer that, we first have to get into the nitty-gritty of what this policy actually does. So let's break down the mechanics of the no tax on tips provision. So at its core, it's a tax deduction, and that's a really important word. This does not mean tips are suddenly tax-free. What it means is that eligible workers can subtract a big chunk of their tip income from what they tell the IRS they earned, which in turn should lower their overall tax bill. So how does it actually work for somebody? Well, you can think of it as a three-step process. First, you've got to earn voluntary tips. That part is key. Then, when it's time to do your taxes, you can deduct up to $25,000 of that tip income. It's not automatic, though. You have to actually claim it on your tax return. And, the fine print here really matters. First off, this isn't permanent. Right now, it's only set to run through 2028. And this is critical. It only applies to voluntary tips. So those mandatory service charges or the automatic gratuities you see for big parties, nope, they don't count. And there's an income cap to make sure it's aimed at middle and lower income workers. And you can totally see why that initial idea is so appealing. We talked to a guy named Colin Sheedy who's been a tipped worker for about 5 years, and his first reaction really captures it. I mean, who wouldn't want to pay less in taxes? It sounds like a simple, straightforward way to get more money in your pocket. So this brings us to the arguments for the policy. Supporters are framing this as some direct, really meaningful relief for hardworking folks in the service industry. And they say it's a pretty smart move for small businesses, too. And this number is really at the heart of their argument. Projections show it could boost the average take-home pay for an eligible worker by about $1,300 a year. For anyone living paycheck to paycheck, that is a significant amount of money. We're talking rent, groceries, car payments. It makes a difference. But the benefit isn't just for the employee. See, for a small business, replacing a server or a bartender is super expensive. It can cost around $8,000 when you factor in hiring, training, all of it. So by making these jobs a little more attractive, the policy basically acts as a tool to help keep employees around, saving owners money without them having to raise wages themselves. And this chart, this explains so much about the politics of it all. You might wonder, why was this championed so hard by Nevada? Well, because a mind-boggling 25% of its workforce is in tipped jobs. Compare that to the U.S. average of just 2.5%. For a state built on bartenders, dealers, and waiters, a policy like this is a huge deal. Okay, but that is only half the story. When you take a closer look at this policy, some pretty serious concerns start to pop up about who it helps and, maybe more importantly, who gets left behind entirely. So let's go back to Colin, the tipped worker we just met. That initial excitement he had, it faded, and it faded fast. He told us that after just a little bit of digging, he started to see this whole thing differently, not as a lifeline, but maybe as a way for employers to get out of paying higher wages. And this right here is the absolute core of the criticism. A massive chunk, more than a third of all tipped workers will get zero, zip, nada from this policy. And why is that? It's because their income is already so low that they don't have a federal income tax bill to begin with. You can't get a tax cut if you don't owe any taxes in the first place. So let's just break that down because it's a really crucial point. Since this is a tax deduction, it inherently helps higher earners more. Think about it. A bartender at a fancy Las Vegas casino who's making great money from tips, they get the full benefit. But a server at a small town diner making a lot less, they get nothing. It's a structure that benefits the top more than the bottom. And the concern actually gets even deeper. Critics are worried about what they're calling a double whammy. So not only do the lowest income workers completely miss out on the tax relief, but they could also get hurt by cuts to social services like Medicaid that were passed as part of the same big legislative package. All of this kind of forces us to step back and ask a much bigger question. Is the financial struggle that so many service workers face really a tax problem at all? Or is it just a symptom of a much deeper issue with how we pay them in the first place? Now check this out. The federal minimum wage for tipped workers has been stuck at $2.13 an hour since 1996. And when you factor in inflation, its actual buying power today has just collapsed to barely over $1. That's the wage floor that tips are supposed to be building on top of. And this leads a lot of critics and worker advocates to what they see as a clear alternative solution. Just get rid of the subminimum wage. Period. Pay all workers the full minimum wage and let tips be what they were supposed to be all along, an extra bonus for great service, not the main way people make a living. Of course, there's a pretty strong counterargument that you hear from the business community. They say if you dramatically hike our labor costs by raising that base wage, a lot of struggling restaurants might have to choose between replacing human servers with iPads and QR codes or just closing their doors for good. It's a real fear in an industry known for its razor-thin margins. This quote from Colin really just perfectly summarizes that critical perspective. He sees the no tax on tips policy as a shiny object, a distraction, something designed to win over service workers politically while completely avoiding the much harder, much more fundamental conversation about raising their actual wages. So where does that leave us? Well, the no tax on tips policy offers some real relief, but it's spread very unevenly. It totally sidesteps the bigger problem of a stagnant subminimum wage, and this is all happening while everyone is feeling burned out by tipping. So as those old tip jars get replaced by digital screens, maybe the real question isn't just about how we tax tips, but whether this entire system is even built to